I'm going to talk about NDP's anti-Palestinian history, current and historical. We saw a very notable example of that in February at the NDP convention in Ottawa, where a resolution was suppressed from even being discussed. A resolution that was supported by at least 25 riding associations, unanimously supported by the Youth Convention, supported by a number of affiliated NDP organizations. And it was a very modest step towards a bit more solidarity with Palestinians. It called for, quote, banning settlement products from Canadian markets and using other forms of diplomatic and economic pressure to end the occupation. So basically, it restated official Canadian policy, but called for banning of products from illegally occupied land. What the Canadian government, Fourth Geneva Convention, etc., all consider illegally occupied. And this resolution was suppressed in a number of different ways, most importantly by the fact that it was put at the bottom of the list of foreign policy resolutions, which meant that there was no chance it would ever be discussed, because only 3, 4, 5 resolutions from the foreign policy basket of resolutions get discussed. And it was put way at the bottom, even though it was by far the most endorsed foreign policy resolution. And then when there was an effort by the proponents of the resolution to move it up the list at a reprioritization meeting on the morning before that formal convention began, the NDP brass did a whole bunch of different kind of shenanigans. Mics weren't working in the meeting, all kinds of things like that. And then they made sure that they were there. Most of the NDP MPs were there at 9 in the morning with all their staff to vote it down, to even have the Palestine resolution discussed by the entire convention. So it was a pretty extreme example of that effort. Unfortunately, there's a whole history there. This isn't the first time resolutions dealing with Palestine solidarity at conventions have been forced off the agenda. In 2011, the Canadian Vote to Gaza resolution there was an effort to get it reprioritized to a better position. When that was successful, just before the vote, NDP staffers enter the room, same kind of dynamic, make sure that the resolution doesn't get prioritized in a way that will allow it to be discussed. So there's this history, there's a current reality of the NDP being willing to adopt repressive, authoritarian type measures to not discuss Palestine and to not have the party not allow the members of the party to even express their will on this issue. And there are many examples that a notable example a few years ago was with regards to different candidates for running for the party. Actually on the island here, or in the Nanaimo area, Paul Manley was blocked from being able to run as an NDP candidate and lead up to the 2015 election because during a previous boat to Gaza, his father, who was a long-time NDP MP in the Nanaimo area, he was on the boat to Gaza. Israel took the boat in the high seas, illegally sequestered the boat, and he was being locked up. And the NDP was refusing to say anything, even though this was an NDP MP. And so at one point, Paul Manley finally made a criticism of the NDP's refusal to call for the release of his father from Israeli jail. And then the NDP used that as the reason to not allow him to run for the candidacy in the Nanaimo area to run on behalf of the NDP in that area. And during the 2015 election, there were, Paul Manley happened before the election and lead up to the election. During the actual election campaign, there were, it's unclear exactly how many, but as many as 8 different candidates that were blocked from running because they had expressed sympathy with the Palestinian cause. The most high-profile example was Morgan Wheeldon out in the Maritimes. He was already elected by his riding association to represent the party. During the election campaign, Conservative Party officials found that he had claimed that Israel committed war crimes in 2014 in Gaza, and he was removed by the central office from his position. Obviously, Israel committed war crimes in Israel, or in Gaza in 2014, when 2,200 Palestinians were killed, mostly women and children. So there's this history of the party repressing, recent history of repressing those standing up with Palestinian rights. You had a really outrageous example of the party doing something in that direction a couple months ago with Dimitri Lascaris. Are people in the room familiar with the story, what happened with Dimitri Lascaris? Well, Dimitri Lascaris he was actually active with the Green Party and moved forward a important resolution on Palestinian rights within the Green Party, I guess 2 years ago or so now. But he's actually quite a prominent lawyer. He has was once ranked as one of the 50 most important lawyers in the country, but he retired from law practice and has been engaged in all kinds of different activism, a reporter with the Real News Network, heavily involved in Palestine solidarity activism. About 3 months ago now, there was a big controversy over there was a protest against B'nai B'rith for their attacks against the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And there was, at the B'nai B'rith office in Toronto, out front of it, and there was a counter-protest to those challenging B'nai B'rith's smearing of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. So pro-B'nai B'rith protesters counter-protested a pro-Palestine rally in front of B'nai B'rith. And a couple of the people who were part of the pro-B'nai B'rith rally put out a video afterwards describing their participation in this pro-B'nai B'rith rally. And in this video, they make death threats against the Prime Minister, against a whole bunch of three Muslim MPs, Liberal MPs, and against Jagmeet Singh. And they make all kinds of very clearly racist comments, Islamophobic comments. And Dimitri Lascaris had been putting pressure on B'nai B'rith, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Michael Levitt, who's the Liberal MP in the riding where B'nai B'rith's office is. He'd been putting pressure on them to come out and denounce these racist comments by the pro-B'nai B'rith people because they had all attacked those organizing in favor of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers as being threatening or dangerous. So he put pressure on all these on Twitter. And in one of his tweets, he said that the two Liberal MPs had more affinity for apartheid Israel than they did for the Liberal Party or the Prime Minister, because they were refusing to condemn the death threats against the Prime Minister and other Liberal MPs. And the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs turned this into a claimed Dimitri was being anti-Semitic, but a whole big campaign where even the Prime Minister would put out a tweet, and I've written about it, and you can look to see if yourselves if you think it's anti-Semitic. To me, it was unequivocally not anti-Semitic. But Hélène Lavadière, the NDP foreign critic, put out a tweet saying, "I consider Michael Levitt and Anthony Housefather to be my friends as well as colleagues, and I condemn the anti-Semitic comments directed against them by Dimitri Lascaris." Okay, so she explicitly names Dimitri, condemns him for anti-Semitic comments, and again, you can look at the background. It's, in my opinion, quite clear that these were not anti-Semitic comments that Dimitri made, but I think you have to also look at it more broadly. Has Hélène Lavadière, the NDP foreign critic, ever named an individual on her Twitter account condemning them for racism? And I brought this up with Lavadière, actually, and her staff, and I presume she has never done it. So the only time she's taken the time to name an individual, condemn their statements as being racist, is towards a pro-Palestinian activist who has a long history of fighting climate change, fighting arms sales to Saudi Arabia, on and on and on, engaging all kinds of progressive activism. And here you have the NDP foreign critic jumping in on the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs efforts to smear him. And I think that that's indicative of a certain kind of headspace within the NDP leadership. Now, So one of the things I brought up with Lavadière and her staff in the aftermath of this was the fact that, so she refers to Michael Levitt and Anthony Housefather, two Liberal MPs, as her friends, and then goes on to attack Dimitri Lascaris. Well, has she ever condemned Michael Levitt or Anthony Housefather for their participation in an explicitly racist organization? Right? So Michael Levitt was a former chair of the Jewish National Fund. Anthony Housefather has done a whole bunch of stuff with the Jewish National Fund. Jewish National Fund, of course, is a Canadian charity, registered charity in this country. 2016, about $28 million was raised for the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund has been cited as a racist organization by the US State Department, by the UN, even by the Israeli Supreme Court. And this is what the JNF's counterpart in Israel, on his website, you can go on his website right now, it describes, basically what the JNF is it controls about 13% of Israeli land. Most of that land was taken in 1947-48 from Palestinians who were driven out of their homes, so it's a major landowner, and it actually also has positions on the Israel Land Authority, which controls almost 90% of Israeli land. On the JNF's website, it says, quote, "A survey commissioned by the KKL-JNF reveals that over 70% of the Jewish population in Israel opposes allocating JNF land to non-Jews, while over 80% prefer the definition of Israel as a Jewish state rather than as a state of all its citizens." So this is an organization, it's openly racist on its website, excluding non-Jews from its land. Of course, 20 to 25% of Israelis are non-Jewish, right? Palestinian citizens of Israel, and so but yet here you have a situation where the NDP foreign critic is basically calling two individuals who have close ties to the JNF being her friends, and it goes into this whole question of actually the NDP has all these ties to this organization, okay? This colonialist organization. So Lavadière, when she was in Israel in 2016, she went to a JNF event. Okay, during the Harper regime, Pat Martin, another NDP federal MP, participated in a JNF event at the Prime Minister's residence to, quote, "recognize and thank the people that have helped to make JNF Canada what it is today." Nova Scotia Premier, NDP Premier Darrell Dexter, has, when he was in Israel, participated in a JNF event. Gary Doer, the former Premier of Manitoba, NDP official, was honored at a JNF event in Winnipeg in 2006, another NDP cabinet minister in 2011. On and on and on and on. So here you have the NDP explicitly tied, having all these ties to an organization that's explicitly racist. The JNF follows policies that we made illegal 70 years ago in this country. Right? There used to be racist land covenants. There used to be land covenants that said in property deeds in Canada, and these were made illegal by the Supreme Court in the early 50s, effectively illegal, slightly complicated, but that said you couldn't sell the land to black people, to indigenous people, to people from Asia, and to Jewish people. And in fact, it was the Canadian Jewish Congress that led the charge against in the famous court battle, the Noble verdict that led the charge against these racist land covenants. But here we have today, 70 years later, the NDP effectively supporting these types of policies in Israel. And so I want to go back a little bit into the history of NDP CCF, the NDP's predecessor, and its connection to Zionism and its connection to Palestinian dispossession. So it didn't actually begin that way. The CCF was ambivalent towards Zionism early on. J.S. Woodworth referred to it as, one comment in 1938, he was the head of the CCF. He said, "It was easy for Canadians, Americans, and the British to agree to a Jewish colony as long as it was somewhere else. Why pick on the Arabs other than for strategic and imperialistic consideration?" 1942, the NDP convention refused to endorse Zionism. It wasn't until 1944 that the NDP convention finally endorsed Zionism. And actually, at that convention, they called on the government, quote, to implement fully the Balfour Declaration of 1917, solemnly made by the government of Great Britain and endorsed by the League of Nations, to facilitate the establishment of Palestine as a Jewish homeland, which should lead to the development of a Jewish Commonwealth. So that's not till 1944 that they come. But they explicitly endorsed the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, of course, is a crass expression of colonialist thought, right? Giving a European political movement the land of an indigenous population. So the NDP its early history is complicated, but by 1944 they had endorsed Zionism and then very much became staunch proponents of Zionism. You have CCF leaders like Tommy Douglas, MJ after Wordsworth, I believe, dies. MJ Coldwell, Tommy Douglas, Stanley Knowles. They were all part of the Canadian Palestine Committee, which is a group of prominent non-Jews who supported Zionism, set up in 1943. In 1944, the Canadian Palestine Committee called on Prime Minister Mackenzie King that it, quote, looks forward to the day when Palestine shall ultimately become a Jewish Commonwealth and member of the British Commonwealth of Nations under the British Crown. So it was very much, the Zionism was tied into pro-British imperialist kind of outlook of Canadian political life. And I can get into that beyond just the NDP question later on if people wanted to get into that. But so there's a great deal of support. The NDP, there's a CCF supports the partition plan of 1947, where Canadian officials played an important role in the UN partition plan that gave the Zionist movement 55% of historic Palestine, even though the Jewish community was less than a third, even though they owned about 7% of the land. From a Palestinian perspective, of course, this was incredibly unjust. And the CCF framed its support for partition in that it was a UN initiative. Well, the Arab countries, Arabs have to accept this because this is a UN initiative, okay? Now, after the 47-48 war, where 750,000 Palestinians are driven from their homes, there's, of course, a UN resolution calling on the right of the refugees to return, right? But the CCF doesn't endorse that UN resolution, right? So they push, we have to endorse this UN call for partition, but then when Palestinians are driven from their homes and UN says, well, they have the right to return to their homes, and then NDP official Alastair Stewart is explicitly saying that it's too much to ask Israel to take refugees, too many of the refugees back. CCF leader MJ Coldwell backed Canada selling 24 F-86 Sabre jets to Israel in the lead up to its 1956 invasion of Egypt, alongside France and England. It justified Israel's war in 1967, and saying that that Israel is justified in attacking its neighbors. After the 67 war, when Israel took charge of East Jerusalem, David Lewis would come out saying that there shouldn't be a division of Jerusalem, that Jerusalem should be under Israel's control. In the mid-1970s, the NDP, notably Ed Broadbent, who was then the federal leader, as well as Stephen Lewis, who was head of the party in Ontario, they attacked the Palestinian Liberation Organization viciously. So when the PLO was looking for UN observer status, Ed Broadbent referred to the PLO, as terrorists and murderers whose aim is the destruction of the state of Israel. And when there was a big UN conference that was going to take place in Toronto in 1975, the NDP, Stephen Lewis, as head of the Ontario NDP, called for the UN conference to not take place. The conference had nothing to do with Palestine.
Was it David Lewis, not Stephen Lewis? He was the head of the NDP.
Stephen Lewis was head of NDP in Ontario from 1970 to 78. David Lewis was the federal leader from 69 to 72-ish, kind of 70, or maybe 71 to 75, or basically at the same time when more or less the same time when Stephen was head of the Ontario NDP, David Lewis was head of the federal NDP. Not quite overlap, but partial overlap. So they called for Stephen Lewis called for the UN conference to, I guess by 75, I think Broadbent becomes head of the party in 74 or 75. So by that point, David Lewis is no longer the head of the party federally. So they called for the UN conference to be shut down just on the basis that PLO representatives might attend. Again, the conference had nothing to do with Palestine, just the possibility that because they've been granted observer status, PLO representatives might attend. So this is extreme anti-Palestinian kind of disposition. And as many, I go into it both in my Canada and Israel Building Apartheid book and my more recent book, Left Right, go into many of these details in more depth. In 1989, the book, The Domestic Battleground, Canada and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, said, quote, "Historically, the New Democratic Party has been the most supportive of the Israeli cause, largely because of its close relationship to Israel's Labour Party and to the Hizdatut, the Israeli trade union movement." Okay. Well, the Hizdatut, which at one point I think it owned more than a quarter of Israel's economy, it excluded non-Jews for decades, right? That it was an exclusive labor organization, right? It was as Golda, former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir saying, a quote, great colonizing agency. That's how she referred to the Hizdatut, because it had much broader political objective than just narrow defending workers' rights and whatnot. The NDP also had very close ties to Israeli Labour Party, as the Domestic Battleground book mentioned, and its predecessor. Of course, the Israeli Labour Party was in charge of Israel politically for most of, during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 47-48. Israeli Labour Party is the chief political agent. The invasion of Egypt in 56. Its war in 1967. So the Israeli Labour Party is a major player in Palestinian dispossession, and Israeli Labour Party officials would often come to NDP conventions, would often had close ties to the NDP, and that actually continues right until today. So at the convention in 2018, there were officials from the Israeli Labour Party. And the Israeli Labour Party is, if you take a look into it, I think they've now changed their name, but is a very viciously anti-Palestinian organization. So the Israeli labor official who was photographed with Jagmeet Singh, the head of the NDP, at the convention in 2018, in the lead up to the convention, he wrote an op-ed basically calling on the NDP not to endorse Palestinian solidarity. He said, quote, this is Michael Baran, who's the Labour Knesset member, who was photographed with Jagmeet Singh. He wrote, quote, "Western progressives must not buy into the simplistic notion that peace is Israel's gift to bestow upon the Palestinians." So again, there's two sides. It's not, Israel doesn't have all the power and doesn't have the responsibility as the occupying force, etc. At the NDP convention, I was told that there was going to be a Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs breakfast. Okay, I didn't believe this. I thought this was some Palestine solidarity person that got going. Okay, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs is not having an actual breakfast at the NDP convention. And I didn't find any confirmation that happened in 2018, but what I did find, is confirmation that did happen in 2016. So the CIJA organizes a breakfast at the NDP convention. Almost for sure it happened again in 2018, but I found a online confirmation of that from 2016. So you have, and you saw it in the lead up to the convention, strong efforts by pro-Israel groups to pressure the NDP leadership to do what they did in terms of suppressing the Palestine resolution. There was a campaign story in the Globe and Mail that claimed that one of the speakers at the convention she was with the Women's March, the post-Trump Women's March, and she had ties to Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan, of course, is an anti-Semitic black leader in the U.S. But they basically, there was a Globe and Mail article in the lead up that tried to that tied her speaking at the NDP convention with Louis Farrakhan's legitimately anti-Jewish comments, and then they started talking about the Palestine resolution. So the first half of the article is this black feminist speaker speaking at the NDP convention, and then they bring in Louis Farrakhan, and then the second half of the article is all about the Palestine resolution, as if it was all kind of one and the same thing, that basically those pushing the Palestine resolution were those wanting this speaker who, you know, has association with somebody who has an anti-Jewish background. So that was almost certainly pushed by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. And the Center in Israel and Jewish Affairs has ties to NDP leaders. So for instance, Hélène Lavadière, the NDP foreign critic in 2016, she went and spoke at APEC, the major pro-Israel lobby organization in the US, at their convention in 2016. They paid for her to go down there. So NDP officials really are willing to have close ties to pro-Israel lobbying organizations. You have Paul Dewar, a couple years ago when he was a former NDP foreign critic participating in a CIJA Young Leadership Israel Advocacy Program retreat. A 2014 calculation found that 20 NDP MPs had been to Israel with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, had gone on all expense paid trips to Israel with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. In 2014-15, Nathan Cullen, his office had a assistant that came through CIJA's parliamentary internship program. So CIJA has a parliamentary internship program. When they get recent university graduates, they pay them $18,000 to be interns with parliamentarians in Ottawa. And so they basically go work. It's free from the standpoint of the MPs. It's free labor. You have somebody that comes into the office, works at your office. And there was a story in the Canadian Jewish News about how Nathan Cullen's office took in somebody by the name of Daniel Gans through CIJA's parliamentary internship program. And then after finishing the internship program, Gans would then become parliamentary assistant to NDP MP Finn Donnelly. So this is just one of the ways in which the pro-Israel lobby organizations in Ottawa influence NDP MPs and have ties to NDP MPs that I think partly reflects and exacerbates really their anti-Palestinian tendencies.
Is it possible to take
Yeah. I'll try to wrap up in maybe even less than that. Now, getting to the thing that's I think incredibly important for people here in Victoria, which is the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group. And the fact that NDP MPs are part of this organization that's explicitly about lobbying for Israel. That's the objective, right? It's to work with its counterparts in Israel. And I did a story, people can look into it, find it online, where the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group works with the Israel-Canada Interparliamentary Friendship Group from the Israeli Knesset. Okay, so they're members of the Knesset and members of the Canadian House of Commons work together. And I looked into all the members of their friendship group in Israel, and that they're supposed to be dialoguing with, working with, and every single one, I think it was 11, maybe it was 13 of the Knesset members that the NDP is working with through the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group, they have all put forward laws or made comments that are just incredibly racist, anti-Palestinian kind of comments, and I was astounded when I did the research for the article. I presumed that I would find that most of these Knesset members were anti-Palestinian or did different things that I think most people consider objectionable. But I was taken aback how every single one of them had expressed views or proposed laws that were, I think, the vast majority of NDP members would consider objectionable, if not racist, explicitly anti-Palestinian. So there's the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group that Murray Rankin, Randall Garrison are both important members, have been part of the executive of. You can find photos of them at the meeting of the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group. And this is something that there has been a campaign to challenge. I think it's one of the most important avenues of putting pressure on the NDP to move away from its anti-Palestinian history. It's incredibly symbolic to have NDP MPs part of an explicit pro-Israel lobby organization. And it's something that, unlike some of the trips to Israel that the MPs take with CIJA, this is something that's ongoing. It's not just a one-off, they won a one-on-one trip and then you can complain about it after the fact, right? Like Tracy Ramsey, the NDP MP right now, she was just in Israel. It probably still is in Israel with Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland. But the parliamentary group is just this highly symbolic a relationship between the NDP and Israel, and it's one that we put forward an open letter that was signed by more than 200 well-known musicians, academics, trade unionists, calling on the NDP back in the summer, calling on the NDP to withdraw from the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group. Anybody who is an activist with the NDP in Victoria area, it's incredibly important to bring it up to either Garrison himself, Garrison staff, Rankin staff, to make it clear that you're going to withdraw your active support for them until they withdraw from the parliamentary group, because this is the Palestinians today, right? There's still a refusal for a Palestinian state on 22% of historic Palestine. We have a situation in Gaza where there have been a couple hundred people killed protesting peacefully over the past few months. More than, I think it's 22,000 people injured. Probably not all of them seriously injured, but certainly 1,000 or more people who have lost the ability to walk. You have a situation of injustice being perpetrated against Palestinians that didn't begin recently. This is an ongoing injustice of a incredibly intense nature, and the responsibility is abundantly clear. This is not a complicated issue. This is a matter of Israel has to be pressured to stop its ongoing theft of Palestinian land, its ongoing violence against Palestinians, and one very small piece in a big international solidarity movement is calling on the supposed progressive party in this country to stop being part of a pro-Israel lobby organization like the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.